on to our discussion about the integrated requirements process, which is, the discussion is based around the book that Peter Brooks has published this year, along with his many other titles he's managed to get in print this year. He's been a very busy man in publishing. So, Peter, do you want to just introduce the concept, and then we'll go through the few slides that you've got to share so that we can get an overview of what it is, and then launch into a discussion with the people we have present.
Yes, thanks, Kirsty. What I thought, as I said in the Hangout, would be interesting is to try and think of a practical, topical example, which is the current security issue many people have got, and talk about the requirements process in terms of that, rather than just in the abstract, because it can be a bit dry in the abstract, and then we can talk about specifics in how to gather requirements and manage them in an integrated fashion to do with the security question. So not spend too long on the slides, enough time just to cover everything, and then discuss the implications.
Great. Okay, well, I'll start the slides for you, since we had a few difficulties getting them running at your end, and if you just let me know when to move to the next slide, we'll take it from there. So just give me one moment.
There we are, we've got the PowerPoint view and the shared view, and now the full view. That's it.
Away you go, Peter.
Okay, thank you. That's the front one. If you move on to the next. The first question is why requirements are important. Just to review it, because I'm sure being here you're familiar with it. If anyone's interested, they'll know this. But what I've come to realize in the process of writing this book and working after it with various people is that actually requirements are really the IP of an organization. It's not the solutions. A solution is simply an instantiation, really, of what your requirements are at a particular time. So as I was saying in a little example here, with banking, it's been the case back since goldsmiths were the bankers, until now that the requirement has been that you have a trustworthy, reliable means of showing that you are entitled to a certain value. It used to be a receipt from a goldsmith, now it's a mobile payment through a cell phone, but the principle is the same. The requirement is a secure, trustworthy transaction to show that you've got that money. We only get value if we understand the requirements, because the requirements are built on value. And ITIL, the business portfolio, is driven or should be driven by requirements. And part of the issue with development is we need to reuse requirements. A lot of work has been done on requirements in different areas, as I'll say in a minute, but unfortunately they often are isolated from each other in different silos. So you don't have reuse. You can't repeat your parts of solution and new solutions. There's wasteful work in rediscovering requirements each time, and a process allows you to integrate that and measure how well you're doing with it. So the idea of the integrated requirement process is that you cross the organizational boundaries and have a central requirements register defining what your corporate requirements are. Could we have the next one, please, Kirsty? These are many of the different views. There are more views, but these are the main different attitudes people have towards requirements. If you look at the bottom right, software engineering, there are many different frameworks for developing software engineering applications, and all of them have some provision for gathering requirements. But there, the requirements are thought of in terms of how is this going to allow us to develop the application. On the left, project managers, because they're not normally given a good description of the project, have to start off defining their own requirements. They have their own language and means of defining requirements. Enterprise architects on the left, a central part of TOGA is gathering requirements and understanding them. But there the perspective is from simply enterprise architecture, perhaps with some connection to software engineering. ITIL discusses in service design getting hold of requirements. There it's requirements for specific services. COBIT looks at requirements in terms of how they should be used for auditing the system. And finally, business analysis, BABOK, does a brilliant job of how to analyze requirements, how to elicit them, how to then apply them to developing solutions, but not as a process and not integrated with all the others. So if you have somebody from each of these areas in a room together, they'll all be discussing requirements, but have completely different perspectives and not perhaps understand each other and where they're coming from. So the next slide, please, Kirsty. Why do we need requirements? This is simply from the ITIL book. You'll probably have known this, that most of the errors that you get in services with applications and programs come from requirements. 80% of them. Only 10% come from developers. So as I said, developers develop things right, but not the right things. A lot of project time is involved in development and testing because so little time is allocated to requirements. If requirements were understood more centrally, you wouldn't have the reinvention in the different areas, and so actually the overall cost of the organization would go down, even though more work was allotted per area. Could you have the next one, please, Kirsty? These are the problems that we mentioned, that there isn't a process for requirements in most of these areas. It isn't integrated. There's no reuse, provision for late requirements. There are always going to be late requirements, but they're often dealt with in a hurry and not dealt with properly. And the big issue is solution-driven. When I'm going to be talking about introducing the idea of how this applies to the security issue, one of the big issues is that people think about solutions. Firewalls, for example, are a solution without thinking about the requirements. I'll get into that in more detail later on. The scope is always per project or per service, or from the enterprise point of view, per business process, without understanding how they should be integrated into the design and development. So we saw lots of duplication, poor reuse, and poor value to the business. The next one, please, Kirsty. This is an example of the requirements process, integrated requirements process. I won't go into all the detail, we haven't got time clearly, but the important point is that there is one overall process driving it from the very start at the top left, where you identify an overall need, as in this case, the one we're talking about, a need to respond to the security threat. It works through a standard process using a central register to end up with an agreed change that's going to become the new service or the new solution to deal with it, crossing the different boundaries as we can see. I think that's enough for this, unless you want to come back to it later on. The next one, please, Kirsty. The main reasons for an integrated process being a benefit are that you've got clear accountability, which you haven't got in organizations at the moment. Many people feel and are accountable for requirements, but only in their particular area. The investment per requirement, just as in the service portfolio, becomes visible. You know how much each requirement has cost you. I'll talk about that in terms of security as well, because that's an important point. It complies with requirements. If you have late requirements, duplicate requirements, or conflicts of requirements, that is visible not just at a management level, but actually from a global governance perspective. So you understand the value of requirements. You are able to check requirements, making sure that requirements don't conflict with policy, and if they do and are important, that you can change policy, making sure you have good governance. You apply effort and cost to business need, not simply to the areas where either they are the most practiced with requirements or make the most noise. The next one, please, Kirsty. This is an example of an integrated requirements register put together as a mock-up on an iPad. And the idea is that it links to the various things we know about metrics, so you can measure them, shows the stakeholders who authorizes it, and it's visible to everybody in the organization. So if they have issues or concerns or further requirements, they can add it. It's of course linked to the risk and CSI register, and for each requirement you set up a RACI matrix so you know who is actually responsible for, accountable for that particular metric. And of course requirements, and these requirements are naturally listed in the service design packages for all the services affected. So you've got a two-way link, and you can see whether there's any commonality of requirement to reduce the overhead. So the next one, please, Kirsty. This was the example I was wanting to talk about. So we can go back if you've got any questions about specifics and look at them. But in this particular case, there's a general recognition now that there is a security threat from various government spying organizations for corporate IP. Now, there's a privacy issue, but I'm not dealing with that one specifically here. I'm looking at it from the corporate point of view. The real issue is, previously we knew as an organization that another company might be undergoing industrial espionage. But it was unlikely. Most companies find it too expensive. There are more obvious ways to go about things, and of course it's illegal. But suddenly that idea of corporate espionage, when aided by a company's intelligence services, becomes a lot more visible and becomes more of an issue for a company. So the first question is, what is the actual requirement for a company? If a company hasn't got any competitors that might be getting intelligence, there probably isn't much of a requirement to change from where they are now. So I think the first message is, if you understand your requirements properly, in a situation like this, there's no need to panic if actually you're not affected by it. I'm not saying that an organization isn't, but one outcome of understanding your requirements could be, well, actually, we're fine. Even if other people are reading our email, even if they're reading our corporate documents, there won't be any competitor who could take advantage of them, so actually we shouldn't be spending any money on it. Of course, if you don't have integrated requirements, there may still be parts of the organization who don't understand corporate policy and go off and do their own thing, costing money unnecessarily. So that's the first thing. From the point of the organization, corporate governance and policy, do we need to do anything? If there are international competitors who might be getting intelligence, then I believe that there should be a policy to try and protect oneself against that. The question then comes from a requirements point of view, who are the stakeholders in this? Who could be affected by this? Well, obviously, marketing, sales, development, R&D are all areas that would be concerned for various companies, but you need to understand who the stakeholders are and gather the requirements centrally. So you don't end up simply responding to the threat to R&D in R&D when you could use the same techniques perhaps to be protecting marketing or other areas. You centralize all your requirements, understand them centrally, so you can then identify what threats are against you as an organization. Is the threat that your IP could be stolen so that somebody in another country perhaps could file a patent for something that you've discovered? Is it a threat that your new marketing or move into another country or marketing to do that could be compromised and countered, and so forth? So know what the threats are, because only when you know the specific threats can you know specifically where you should target your response. Then look at weaknesses, because of course part of the response is to understand how do we protect stuff. The other is to say, where actually are we vulnerable? Starting at the point of view of architecture, business architecture, see how that architecture could be compromised. Within that, look at individual services. Services should all have an element about security. See whether that element deals with its issue. Mainly to date, security issues have been more about physical compromise or security through inadvertent disclosure and so forth, down to a component. Then go back with these requirements, talk to the stakeholders, and make sure these really are the requirements, generate solutions and business cases, and then implement them. Using the requirements register means that next time there's a new service or a new business process, you can reuse your learning of this experience as policy. Looking at it specifically, because that's all general top level how it would run, what I see is analyzing an organization, you're saying where actually is there a chance of our data being compromised. I think one of the benefits of requirements thinking is that you can find that out not just by looking at technical documentation about weaknesses, vulnerabilities, but thinking about the opposition, thinking about who is doing the spying and saying, what are their requirements? What are they actually trying to find out? If they were going to connect to our system, why would they be looking at us, and what would they be doing, and how would they be doing it? So working from the bottom up, there's a very nice device I've got here. You may have seen something like this. You seen one of these?
Do you want me to take the screen share off now, Peter?
Okay, just pop the screen share off and see if you can see this little.
Looks like an audio cassette to me.
Yes, it does, and it's smaller than an audio cassette. But this is actually a Wi-Fi router. It connects to 3G on the one side, and it allows you to then have all your devices, if you're off-site, connect through this as if it was an ordinary Wi-Fi hotspot. Wonderful piece of technology. It satisfies a lot of requirements for being on the move without changing. When you're traveling, you don't really want to reconfigure your machine all the time, and fitting in USB dongles always changes your environment. Here, all you do is you connect your own hotspot, and wherever you go, you're connected. That's your requirement that they have satisfied. But what is the requirement of the manufacturers of this box? It's made by a Chinese company, as it happens. If you were wanting to have this box in the service of industrial espionage, how difficult would it be? Well, my feeling is that it would be very simple, because what you need to know about somebody, anybody in a company, is what are they connecting to. If you're connecting to a corporate VPN, if you're connecting, sending email to particular people, all of that will go through this device, all of your connections. And it's possible simply by sending a little cache of IP addresses back home to have a profile of exactly what this particular user or users of this portable hotspot are doing, invisibly to the user, because it's all going through the 3G connection. If you looked at any of the Wi-Fi stuff, you would see no foreign connections at all. The reason I mention this is new, but already there are devices like this in most organizations called firewalls. If you buy a commercial firewall from someone, there it's got a piece of software that's watching all of your communication through your organization. If it calls home, presumably for diagnostic purposes or statistics purposes, and happens to send just a cache of your IP addresses, that can be analyzed to show exactly the pattern of use of your company. Furthermore, you've got all of your setup of encryption, SSL. As we know, the SSL encryption can't really be broken by other commercial companies, but it can be broken by intelligence services. So if you have any information going across SSL to your bank or from an organization to your corporate directors, you know it can be read by the security services. So, and we know that because recently there was a bill in the UK coming out where they were going to limit access to various things across the internet. One option was to limit access to SSL, and the security services were consulted about this and didn't raise any concerns. They didn't actually wish to have SSL stopped or compromised or anything done to it, indicating that they had no issue getting through SSL already. It's not actually difficult for them to see. This means now, because we know that intelligence services are looking actively at stuff, sharing it commercially, any of your traffic can be available commercially to other people. The other vulnerability, of course, is the most popular software. If you were a spying organization, your requirement would be to get the best intelligence for the minimum cost. And I think thinking in terms of being a spying organization and their requirements, even if they haven't acted in their best interest and are not fulfilling them, is a sound way of understanding where the difficulty is coming from. What are their requirements? Cheap access to as much intelligence as possible. So the most obvious target would be an operating system, because there you do your encryption, there you have all of your emails, all of your documents in clear text. Even if you encrypt your data on your disk, it's still in clear text in the operating system. The obvious one to use if you have control over it is the operating system that is most common, which happens to be Microsoft. Would Microsoft allow backdoors for the security services if they were paid money? It would be very odd if they didn't. Would Cisco allow backdoors if they were given money, or the other providers? It would be odd if they didn't. So I think an organization has to assume, as a matter of course now, that if they're using Windows, it's compromised. If they're using Cisco routers, it's compromised. If they're using little devices like this that can come on board without anyone even knowing about them, it can be compromised in that case to a different intelligence agency. So the question comes how to address this, and part of the question is the one I started off, understanding the requirements from a corporate point of view and policy. Simply put, how paranoid do you have to be? If you, as I said, don't really mind people seeing your email and your corporate plans, then there's very little that needs to be done. If you are paranoid, though, it would be clear, I think, that the first issue would be get rid of those popular binary-only systems. If you haven't got the source code to examine yourself, you can have no control of what's actually going on. So if you buy a router and it's got source code, you can assume other people can read what's going through the router. If you have an operating system and only have the source code, you can assume the same thing. So the first requirement, I think, would come to an organization that was serious would be to remove all software where you don't have open source, where that's possible. Linux then becomes pretty well the only operating system that's usable in these circumstances, but you'd have to get further, because if you're properly paranoid, you realize that intelligence agencies could put developers onto a Linux team to insert malicious trapdoors into Linux. So you would have to make effort yourself to minimize the amount of Linux that was communicating to the outside world, so as to minimize that risk. With devices like this, the Huawei Chinese device, the most obvious thing is not to use them, but if you are going to use them, you'd have to make sure that all of your traffic was encrypted, not using SSL, but ideally using an encryption method that is secure. There is only one secure encryption method known to man, apart from the possibility of quantum computing, which is not really there, which is the one-time pad, which means that you give all of your employees a number. When you talk to them face-to-face, they use that number in order to encrypt all messages. You have your own number. Because you give employees the words verbally, unless someone actually listens into the conversation, they don't know the key that you're using to encrypt them. Only if you encrypt things where the exchange of keys is done completely privately can you then encrypt messages so that they're not interpretable. So I believe that the one requirement for developers now, or vendors, would be to start producing systems that can use key-based, private key, one-time pad solutions for encryption, and an organization should be trying to do that. In the short term, of course, if you can't do all these things, because most people can't rip out Windows very quickly, the thing would be to concentrate, having a service portfolio on your most important services, understand the requirements for the business-critical architectural areas, and implement these measures in those areas. So start moving open-source Linux solutions into your key top business processes in order to encrypt your confidential information, and then gradually extend the scope. If you do have firewalls, my personal belief in the solution is if you have one firewall from Cisco, you should have that on the outside, knowing that that can be compromised by one country. Then on the inner firewall, you'd have another router from someone like Huawei, knowing a different intelligence agency could read that one. If the two firewalls are in series, then the one won't let the others traffic through. So the two will cancel each other out, and you ought to have a fairly clear connection. Obviously, it's better to have your own firewall where you control the software and decide exactly what will go in and out. But the initial requirement would be to try and prevent either country sharing your commercial information. Now, that's a very brief outline, and I've probably taken enough, so I'll stop here to open up the discussion.
As I said, coming back to the, I guess, to a little bit of the theory behind the integrated requirements process, how does it, I mean, obviously, as you were talking in the beginning, the different disciplines, the business analysis, the project managers, the governance specialists are all talking in different languages. So how can your integrated requirements process help to bring them together so that they actually can get into a room and be talking the same language?
I think if you go back to that slide showing the repository, the penultimate slide, that's the best one to answer that question.
Okay, I'll just go and find that. Just you carry on talking while I bring it back.
The point is, every requirement, and unless every part of the organization will know this, a requirement needs to be clear, unambiguous, and make only one requirement. In other words, if you say something must be this and that, that's two requirements. Mm-hmm. One simple requirement, understandable in plain English to everybody, including the external people. This is not always possible of internal technical requirements, but it should be true of all top-level policy and business requirements. So if we look at this mock-up...
Just a minute, I will just share that now.
This is just to give an idea how it might be used. There we are. I think we can just see it. If you look at the
just give me a moment. Just a minute, Peter. I just want to fix that for a second.
There are only 2 bits. 3 bits I'll actually talk about rather than going into tons of detail, because there is too much on here to get into discussion. The top bit, the requirements, it says audit history shall preserve, preserve dated, timed records of all changes with author, contacts, and category, reason, and event hashtags. So that's a requirement. It's probably too detailed at that level because it's multiple requirements. It would be split down into different ones, but it's understandable as one requirement. The important thing is that all the different people could understand that. If there's anything that's not understandable, on the right-hand side where it says tweets, it's possible for people to express concern. So if somebody didn't understand something or wasn't clear how it meshed in, they could actually direct a tweet towards this particular requirement, and the owner of the requirement could then respond to it. Also, in the middle it says hashtags. The idea would be that if a project manager saw this as a project deliverable, for example, they could put their own description there. If the enterprise architect saw it as part of a business process discussion, they could push their hashtag there. So in essence, you can have the different understandings linked into the same requirement. So even though it's one requirement, different parts of the organization, if they see it differently, can discuss and understand it. So this becomes a central position for discussion, clarification, and understanding. You only have one record, but if it needs to be interpreted to be understood by a project manager or a service manager, that can be accommodated through the classification or description fields. I don't know if that answers the question, Kirsty.
Okay.
So, Peter, just before my battery dies on my laptop, because I've got to bring the charger home with me, wouldn't this fit better into the TOGA framework? Because I see this as a key part of what an enterprise architect should be doing, really, making sure that they understand the requirements of the whole organization.
Yes, I agree. It should be part of enterprise architecture. Absolutely. And in the TOGA structure, requirements are the central bubble. And this, I believe, this integrated requirement process fits exactly into that TOGA bubble. But what TOGA often discovers, TOGA practitioners, is they have difficulty communicating with business analysts, with service managers, with other parts of the organization. So though it definitely sits in enterprise architecture, it needs to connect to all of these other different areas. It can't just sit there. And also it needs to connect to the corporate risk register, so it becomes actually part of corporate policy, not simply sitting in TOGAF. Quite often, unfortunately, TOGAF is run by IT type people rather than business type people. And really, TOGAF should be part of a governance structure, and services also services should be part of a governance structure. And what the Integrated Requirements Register does is allow that central governance by the board, because this is essentially owned by the board, not by enterprise architecture or service management, though various sub-details might be.
Okay. That's cleared up that part then about it being owned by the board.
So, Peter, just sort of thinking through, I liked your question about, well, how paranoid are you? Interestingly, when you're looking at those 6 different areas in one room to talk about these requirements, you would expect that they will have harvested all those requirements up into this central point, and they then become the representative of those requirements, and to be able to talk about, I guess, their agenda, their concerns, or their perspectives of that particular requirement. As you said, it's that place for, I guess, talk about any conflicts of where it comes. So is the board, as that owner, I mean, who gets to put the kibosh where there is a conflict? You know, how do you go about having that in the process where you've got the authority levels of the stakeholders sorted out so that we don't get the infighting that this could cause?
Well, that's why it's owned by the board. The conflicts come up for 2 different reasons, probably more, but in this particular case, the main conflicts come either because the requirements are not fully understood or they're understood differently. So there may be the same requirement for something expressed in service management language, audit language, and development language, and it's the same thing. In that case, the 3 different requirements for the same thing need to be integrated into one requirement. The register keeps a history. So if you want to say we had this requirement coming from development, this one coming from service management, and they're joined, you can see that they're being joined, you see why they're being joined, and the fact that they are the same requirement. So
I think that definitely is a BA skill, in being able to pull the different language of the same requirement into one.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And I think business analysis skills work extremely well with this. They'll definitely be involved. The great thing about this is that the scope of their involvement should increase so that they can start communicating more with service managers, enterprise architects, and business people, because at the moment they often don't. At the moment there's often a parallel stream between business analysis and development, with service management actually hardly involved in the process. So service management is gathering its own requirements quite differently and in a different way and with different aims, with duplication from business analysis. So having a central process, I agree, yeah, the refining, the actual work to turn a requirement that's incomplete or not properly understood would be done by business analysis. But to finish your first question, the other conflict comes where there are actually different requirements. So one part of the organization, let's say the sales organization, requires X and manufacturing requires Y, and they're contradictory. That's exactly why it has to be owned by the board. The only people who can actually make a decision about what the corporate policy is going to be is the board. It can't be done at a lower level because you know, the manufacturing director and the sales director are going to disagree fundamentally. The board needs to take that conflict, understand it, and make a judgment as to what the actual corporate requirement is. That's why it has to be owned at that level. At the moment, what tends to happen is either there's a fudge, a compromise, where the 2 conflicting requirements are put in place in different places, which means that the corporate is failing in governance. It's not actually having a policy, it's got conflicting policy, and that will fail, or should fail, an audit, and also means that the organization is working against itself. So it has to be removed, and it should be removed by the board.
Do you think that, I mean, I can understand for certain organisations wanting to have verbal key passes and things like that, that they might exchange the one-offs, as you talked about, as well, to protect themselves. What percentage of organisations do you think, I don't know if we could do this, whether we do this on a Europe, US, Oceania basis or a global basis, what percentage are really in need of going that far?
To have one-time passwords?
Yeah.
Well, at the moment it seems like it's going a long way, because you have to put together the software, the processes, and so on to do it. So at the moment, I'd say only a few very reasonably paranoid organizations, banks, security services will do it already. They already do that. Industries like space engineering, where there's a lot of competition between, say, European air manufacturers, airplane manufacturers, US air manufacturers, they'd have a real need for it.
I can imagine pharmaceutical companies doing the same thing with their research.
Absolutely, absolutely, and they've got the money to spend. Now, if some of their work is put into the open source arena, it makes it cheaper for everybody, including them, and these things can start being used. They obviously have to be open source, because otherwise someone could inject malicious so-called solutions that would allow even more espionage. But I think stuff like open source firewalls would be an obvious thing for people to start producing, where you could have a firewall and know that you had absolute control of everything that went in and out of that. I mean, if you're really paranoid, you might think that Intel has got, the chip manufacturers have got trapdoors into their chips, in which case you're going to have trouble with that. But I think that at the hardware level, you're probably fairly safe, though I could be wrong. So as long as you implement open source software on your firewalls, that provides some immediate relief from the danger. Then you can start replacing your dangerous proprietary operating systems like OS X or Windows, or any one that you have to buy as a binary, and replacing them with Linux systems.
Having had a look at that process flow, I'm thinking that really it's a combination of what you were talking about previously, where it brings in the governance, it brings in the CSI register, the Service Improvement Register, and brings in the whole service portfolio management flow.
Yes.
Would you say that if we had a closer look at the activities within the process, that we would actually see a combination of those tasks in there?
Absolutely, yes. In the book itself, Kirsty, if you move back to that process diagram, it's just 2 slides back from where we are now. On with that.
Just a moment. Have you got it there?
Okay. Now, each of those boxes, just choose one. It's not that clear at that side. Well, if you look at the right, change approval. Change approval then links down to the change approval process. At the bottom in CSI, you have the CSI process, and what actually happens if you drill down to that level, the integrated requirements process links into each of those areas. So all of the ITIL 5 areas of strategy, design, transition, operation, CSI have a process element linking into them where they contribute to the overall process. Sorry. So yes, in the book, this actually decomposes down into a set of about 10 or 15 sub-processes. This is just the top-level view of the overall flow.
And do you think that knowledge management process activities are playing a huge part? And I mean this not just from, I'm not just talking about the knowledge required in support, something like maybe the Abashi methodology, you know, looking at the data flows across the whole organisation to be able to assist the BAs, etc., in gathering all this information and putting it into that central place.
I think that's absolutely crucial. If I was starting off doing knowledge management in an organization, it's almost like a bootstrapping process, because the first thing you need for knowledge management is to understand the requirements for knowledge. And those requirements go across the organization, they go across all processes, they go across, and they're top-down as well, because they're coming from corporate policy. So building a knowledge requirements repository just for that area will actually decide how you would implement this integrated requirements process, because that would be one of the requirements for knowledge. So that the two are intimately intertwined. Once you do start implementing your knowledge management, fitting in with those requirements, naturally all of your future requirements will be fitted into that. And the gathering, processing, understanding, analysis of requirements will be part of that overall process. So knowledge management should only be done in response to requirements. You shouldn't be just gathering arbitrary knowledge because it seems a good idea and storing it. And everything in there should be responding to a particular need, a particular requirement that ultimately you can trace back to corporate policy.
Do you see this, I'm not sure, I haven't read your book yet, so I don't know how detailed it will actually get. Do you see this process taking a foothold at the moment, or is it something that's still needing to be realised in people's visions?
Mostly the latter. Most people have not thought of this. Whenever it's mentioned to any group, when I've given presentations, mostly in South Africa or Sweden, people that are involved in business analysis, enterprise analysis, are really excited about this, and there are a few companies that are using this at the moment in order to get an integrated requirements process going themselves. There's a couple of companies in Sweden that are extremely interested and have been using the book for their purposes, and I was giving a presentation recently in Canada, and somebody who'd been working not in IT but gathering requirements for the Canadian government for their, interestingly enough, for their security, government security system, for want of a better word, their overall, how the whole government was going to manage their security in all departments across the whole Canadian government. They said that was a massive job of understanding and managing requirements, and they would have loved to have had this as a basis to use for that. And they were extremely enthusiastic about it as something to use in the future. So I think it'll get a hold. What I'd like to be able to do is work with people to, for example, move this requirements repository from a mock-up in a book into something actually usable in a real organization. I think the pressure has to come from practitioners who want this rather than vendors who normally respond to need rather than bringing out new things just on spec.
Well, all you need is that first header row and the second row of data in the spreadsheet, and you're off and running, aren't you?
Yes, actually, yes. It is. The ramifications are enormous. I mean, you need to have a good service portfolio, you need to have a way of managing your service design packages and so forth, but certainly you can get a lightweight one going, and as long as it's communicated across the organization that this is the repository. I mean, there's an element of awareness and so on. You can't just have one person set this up on their own, and it has to be, as usual, driven with senior management support. The board has to understand the benefits. What I quite like about this security issue at the moment is it is something that centralizes all those areas. The board is concerned. enterprise architecture, services, all the different areas will have concerns that they need to deal with. And at the moment, there's a great danger they're all going to go off and spend money and time and energy rediscovering all the same things. So it will be a great thing, a great opportunity for companies to come together and use the security issue as a means of building the knowledge and requirements process and repository that they need for the future.
So do you think it'll probably be at least another 12 months before we see any solid case studies come out of this?
That's probably reasonable. I'm hoping that I'm going to be in touch with the people from Sweden and ask how things are going. I've been in touch with them a couple of months ago, and they said they were progressing well, and I hope I'm going to get case studies from them. So I'm hoping to gather them, but realistically, I think good case studies will take that sort of time. If, of course, there's more interest in dealing with the security matter, maybe it'll be possible to get some of those earlier. I don't know if you've got any customers or colleagues who are interested in that area, because that might be a good one, as I say, to build on.
Oh, there could certainly be some interesting facets to it. I'm not sure if, as you said, it does take the practitioners to sort of want to, you know, wave the flag of this, so to speak, to get some traction on it. I'm not sure how much influence they would have at that point of getting to the board level, where that governance needs to be, I guess, struck to light the match or put the fire underneath their feet to really get this off and going. It's certainly worth exploring. It'll be really interesting. I'd like to see, after people have maybe seen this recording, put in their comments and issues or stories that they get from this. Kirsty, do you think it's possible, if we go back to Peter's slide where it showed the different stakeholders that were listed there? One of the things that, for all having good process and bringing those activities together, and that comment you made about how paranoid people are, it's interesting that the organisation itself can be paranoid, but
yes.
I find internally that those units aren't very much talkative or in communication with each other, and they actually get paranoid when they're talking to each other, let alone
Yes.
paranoid about what's coming from the outside. So I would imagine that there'd be, I guess there would have to be a little bit of using the stick from a governance perspective to keep those people in the room and say, sort it out.
Absolutely. I would say if anyone was interested in doing this in an organization practically, the first step would be to assemble a description of the risk for the organization and raise that with the board's risk committee. Every board of directors ought to have a risk committee, and if they haven't thought about it already, which they probably have, to alert the risk committee to the nature of the risk and the possible responses would be the correct place, because they obviously are concerned about complying with audit requirements, and they would then raise the matter as a risk to the board and be able to get hold of funding in order to start the awareness process and the building of consent. I think it's a second slide, actually.
Okay.
The visual of it was like the mind map of the different areas.
Oh, yeah, it's this one, which seems to not be coming up for some reason.
No, that can happen sometimes. PowerPoint decides it's too difficult to show the picture. It worked the first time.
And it was such a pretty picture.
It is. It's a lovely picture. Just let me exit the show, and there it is there. No.
There it is there on the side, yeah. It may put it up now.
My computer doesn't like it at the moment.
Yeah, it's funny, PowerPoint. Sometimes it's happy, and other times it just decides it's too much work. I could perhaps share mine from here, though that could be asking for trouble again. Let me just see if Keynote can come up and do it.
I just think that it's one of those things that you can use the fear stick, as I call it, you know, that everyone's so fearful about what will happen if we don't do this, and you can say that you will do it because of the, I guess, serious nature of the consequences, whether they might be legal or financial or otherwise. Or is this going to then be addressed as a cultural change issue, as we would like to do in anything in service management? If you're going to introduce a new way of, I guess, reducing the silos and getting people engaged.
Yes, I think it's got to be both, definitely. People have to be engaged. There has to be really good awareness and communication. And the fear side is I don't think so much fear as a matter of just having a proper understanding of the requirement from the point of view of corporate risk. Some organizations may not have it, and a word from the board saying, look, we understand the threat, we thought about it, and actually we do not, as a company, have a need to spend money addressing it at the moment. Some people may want to wait until some of the tools become available to then use them, which is perfectly fine. But where it is something that's required, yeah, good communication is essential to make it part of the corporate culture, and it's a chance to have requirements become better understood, and for the conversation to start between those different groups, as in this diagram. I think you've got it there, Kirsty. It seems to be agreeing this time. It can manage it. But yeah, each of these groups needs to be part of the discussion, and rather than isolated discussions with each other, it becomes one discussion with the integrated requirement process, with the use of that register. I think if you look at how many areas there are, the difficulty in the past might be that, yes, service management and enterprise architecture may be happy working together, but you've still got business analysis, software engineering, project management left out in the cold. And what's important is for all these areas to work together to come to a common understanding.
I think that's where the board role is going to be absolutely critical here, because just like with any budget, everybody's looking for a piece of the pie, and they all have their agenda and reasoning as to why they should get the greater portion of the pie. So I think it would be important that the board would say that for BA, for the governance, enterprise architecture, software engineering, project management, and service management here, that for those 6 key areas, that they have to be understood they're on an equal playing field, that they have equivalent status, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Because
yes,
as soon as you give a big status to a project over and above something else, the something else usually gets trampled.
Yes, and that becomes a flavor of the month, of course, that everybody wants to be involved in a new thing, which is fair enough too. And I agree with you that that's the danger. But again, if it's managed in terms of requirements, then you develop the requirements and they point you towards where it needs to be. Everyone's got a case to make and they've got reasons, but once you understand the requirements, you objectify them, you link them to corporate policy, actually the answer appears. These are the people who should be involved with that, these should be doing that, and this is how the rest will cooperate. The book itself, I can't give an answer and say it's got to be this group. We both agreed earlier, yes, business analysis ought to be involved here. They've got the skills. In one organization, that'll be perfect. In another place, the business analyst may not be sitting there. They may actually be sitting in the business or somewhere else. So it's a matter of what the first thing that they talk about in requirements analysis is enterprise analysis. How is the enterprise structured? Who are the stakeholders? You know, the standard business analysis step, and then understand the corporate requirements and work out how those are going to be put in place best. And once that's together as a project, I think that there'll be 1 or 2 possible solutions. The board can choose them because they're based on sound requirements analysis. They will be the right thing to do.
So, soon do you think before, as you see this go through with the guys in Sweden, that you find that you might have another, an updated edition come out of your book?
Well, I haven't thought about that yet, but obviously the more feedback we get from people about improvements and adjustments, the better. There was a review posted quite recently on the book that seemed very positive. If there's specific requests or requirements, dare I say it, for improvements, I'd be very happy to work at another edition as soon as it makes sense.
Yeah, it's actually quite a big review. It looks like David Lowe spent quite some time really reading through it quite thoroughly. We've
got another couple of reviews in progress at the moment. I've had some feedback from people in the last few days who are getting ready to post reviews for this as well. So, and the feedback I've had so far has been overwhelmingly positive. But again, I guess it's that whole thing of trying to get so many people around one table talking the same language is never going to be easy.
It's been that way for a millennia or more, I think.
That's right. And then the board is always
Well, I don't have any other questions at this point, unless there's something that's really stuck out in your mind, Peter.
Well, I was just going to say that if this particular discussion you've been having, because I thought it would be useful to consider this in the light of the security threat. If that is something that has got general interest, then adding that as a discussion at the end of the book about implementing that particular thing would probably make a lot of sense. And that could be done fairly quickly, especially for the electronic version of the book.
Well, I mean, Peter, it's just as I mean, the way we're publishing as a print on demand at the moment makes it very easy to do for both. It's not a difficult process for either the print or the electronic version, so it's certainly something that could be added if we feel it's that gives value.
I think there's
so maybe we should just appeal to anyone who's watching this that if they have got suggestions or think it would be a good idea to have an appendix discussing the security issue or another one, please to just post them to us and we'll prioritize, understand the requirements and take action on the ones that make sense.
I think that's what you'll probably find is that if you've got that appendix for the security section, say, you might want to have one around how does it help address issues of, I guess, commercial sabotage as opposed to, you know, other types of security risks that may happen for banks and things.
Well, I see them as the same. I mean, as far as I can see, once a door is open to allow commercial espionage, industrial espionage to any group, an organization has to take steps. And once you've opened that door and decided to do that, it becomes the standard thing that people should do. Because
I think there's a very big can of worms, especially when you combine this with the current bring your own device issues. I mean, you know, you've got your little router there that you had before. It's so easy now for many organisations who allow their employees to have their own devices and use them. And in fact, organisations are calling for more support from that perspective. So that would be an interesting thing as from a security point of view, where organisations aren't able to stay locked down as such anymore. From that perspective, there's a big part for it to play in terms of defining those requirements.
Yeah, maybe it would be an impetus towards having an open source phone, because at the moment there isn't a phone where you can actually compile the source yourself, so you don't know quite what your phone's up to.
Yeah, all very interesting. I'm very glad to have had a look at this particular topic, Peter, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time, Simone, and Peter. It's been a great discussion and some good questions coming out of it. So yeah, we will. If as Peter said, anyone who's watching this, please send us your questions. You can tweet to IT Shift, and the questions will be passed on to Peter, or go to any of our channels on Google Plus or Facebook and send some questions, and we'll make sure that they get to Peter and we come up with some answers for you. So
thank you very much.
Thanks everybody for your time.
Much.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Peter. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.